Our next speaker is Steve Tufty, and Steve, I'll let you take it away and talk about moving up the monitoring maturity matrix. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of M's in there, but what we're trying to do is part of the issue of getting quality is being able to measure what it is that you're doing. And so part of what we want to do is talk about how we can get better monitoring how we can get better monitoring inside the company that we're in. So the problem definition is basically that we want to accurately show the uptime for various services that are required by the company. So IS has got a whole lot of services that they're providing for the company. And so what always happens is say, well, okay, how are we doing with those services? Are they working? And so this is a way of figuring that out. So the tools that we use Splunk, we use Thousand Eyes, which is, Splunk is it's a data aggregator, so it gets log files together so you can look at log files from various sources and you can put them together and do some correlation. Thousand Eyes is a network monitoring tool, and so we use that as input. We were using Selenium, and Selenium was being called from the Visual Studio with C#, and we had some virtual machines there. So this is the environment we used. So the trade-offs that we were looking at, we were doing black box testing instead of white box testing. So the idea is that we're looking at this from the outside. We don't know that much about the guts. There's a whole piece of if you know about the guts and looking at the log files that we can get at. That's not what we were doing. And we were doing active monitoring versus passive. So that basically means that we were hitting the system instead of just sitting back and looking at it. So we were actually influencing part of the behavior. And the big question for all the applications is that is this thing going to degrade my performance? And that was a problem because there was other monitoring clients that got put on their machines, and it had a load on the system. And the way I feel about that is that yes, there is a load, but if you're running at 97% anyway, there's more problems. So we got to figure out what's going on with that. So the product was basically a chart of the uptime. So this is what the CIO presents to his peers. And so what we're looking at is how were the services, what was availability over the last month and over the last 12 months. And so the chart, we would update it daily, and so there would be some changes here. And we want to make sure this was accurate. What was happening is that we came in and replaced a system that showed 30% uptime for some of these services, and that was obviously not correct. So nobody looked at it because they said, well, that's a bunch of jazz, we don't look at it. And so then the goal was the 99.9% uptime. So you'll see the ones in red there have less uptime than what's provided. I had to do some redaction there because, that's kind of the way it works. And so you'll notice there's applications that we have, and there's also network components with that. So the network components was from Thousand Eyes. What we basically did is we had tests that would go and hit the edge routers on these various other places and come back. And so if that went down for a while, then we'd show it on this. And you can see that third one down went down for a little bit and caused an issue last month. So that's kind of where we are. So how do you determine the uptime? So there's a lot of different ways to determine uptime. The first one we did is we tested to make sure that the machine was powered up. So what we did is we were running Splunk, and we would have that with our universal forwarders, and it would be Chef as a deployment. It would deploy the universal forwarder, which is the client that works on the remote machine, and we would come back and register to our system that, hey, I'm a machine that wants to be monitored. So then what we would do is we would ping this basically once a minute and say, are you up, are you up, are you up? And that worked, but it was kind of limited. So part of the limitations were that the machine could be up, but the service not running. So that's a problem. So is it really providing the service? No, if the service isn't running. There was another issue is that sometimes what would happen is that there's other times when you've got services that these depend on. So for instance, a network service, a database could be down. The machine pings fine, but is it providing service? Well, not really. So that's one way of determining the uptime. Another one we did is to look and see if you could render a login page. So again, using Selenium, what we did is we said, okay, you go there, it does the login page render, and what we would do is we would go and put a username in, and we'd read the username back, and if it matched, we said, okay, you're up. because that's the level of monitoring that application wanted to have. So then we got a little further and we said, okay, do you actually allow a login? So do you have a login from a local user, or are we using a network credential? This is a little bit better because now not only is the login page have to render, we would go and we'd log in, which means there's some kind of authentication going on, and we'd actually go look at the page that's being served up. So getting better. And then we had some other applications that what they would do is they had a JSP, a Java server page, and we would go and hit that page. It would go and read from the database, and then it would write to the database and read back from it and give some kind of connectivity, some information about the connectivity and how long it took for the round trip. And so we would be able to look at that. So that's better still because now we're going and we're testing some of the components. And so we're doing that on some of the pages there too. And the thing is that I thought was kind of funny is that this was one application. They said, okay, you can test our database, but they didn't want us to test their login page. It's like, come on guys, let's put this all together and make it all work. And then where we want to get to is applying synthetic transactions. So in other words, what we would do is we would have some transactions that be set up through Selenium, or we're also looking at using Tosca, which is another tool to use for doing for going and faking that you're a browser or faking that this is a WPF application. You can go and control these things and run them. And so what we'd want to do is create some synthetic transactions and see when they come back and how long does it take for this round trip, and you put out an order and how long does it come back to show that there's a request from the distribution center for I need these pieces. So that's kind of where we wanted to get to. And so this is where we are. This is a matrix of basically where we stand today with this. And there's some, like I say, there's some places that say the login page, it renders and it's accessible, and that's what they want to see. And it's like, okay, that's good, but is that really your service really up? And so you'll see that all the servers are all pinging, and that's all great. One of the things that the ping server did is it allowed us to know if there's a network outage. So in other words, if we had 10 machines that stopped pinging all of a sudden, and they all had the first 3 octets of their IP address were all the same, then we think the backhoe came and wiped out that particular piece. So it gave us information, but it's not really where I think we want to be. So this is kind of the matrix in itself, and the whole idea is to allow them to come down into the business transactions and defining what those are, and that's kind of where we want to go. So we had some hurdles, we had some constraints. So one of the biggest issues we had was dealing with maintenance windows. So the last thing we want to do is to put out fake data out there. Data is not accurate. So what we do is we said, okay, there's maintenance windows that are available. Most of the time, they told us beforehand. Sometimes they didn't. So then all of a sudden, we started getting these alerts, and oh yeah, and I get over there, walk to the guys, and say, well, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you we had a maintenance. It's like, okay, great. So anyway, you want to deal with that. There was resistance to the universal forwarder, which is something I touched on earlier, where the idea is that to say, look, this thing is consuming resources. We're limited with our resources, so what are you doing taxing my system when it's not really doing anything? So we had that was kind of a hurdle. And then one of the things we noticed is that the logging's not always optimally done. So we have third-party software that we're using, and they had critical errors being sent as info logs. And it's like, okay, guys, this is something we really need to know about. So the idea of being able to understand what that is and getting the log files with that. And so the other one is that the goal for this was to not impact the development, even though there's pieces that we needed them to change in order for us to do our work with this. And so these are all kind of things you have to deal with. And one of the things that we did, here's the lessons that we learned. So one of the pieces that we learned was to bring the raw data into the aggregator. So in other words, we would have our ping server sitting out there, and it would say, at first we tried to say, okay, 5 pings sounds good. If you miss 5 pings within 5 minutes, then that's a problem, and that's something we want to address. So what we did is then we do that, and then here these people want to reboot their servers, and then say, okay, hey, you're getting these ping failures. I know I'm rebooting. What are you doing? So what we decided to do is to have the ping count and the duration of the ping outage sent up to Splunk. So the idea there is that you can tune these things. You can run back historical data and say, okay, given this information, would this thing have caused the alert or not? And work with the teams in order to get them to trust the system, because we want to be working with them. And I see old government adage, we're the government, we want to help, right? So it was that kind of thing. And so the idea is that you work with them to provide a value to them. And you want to make sure you're accurate. So this goes back to the whole idea that the maintenance windows, how do you make sure that you're accurate? So one of the things we did with that was to reduce the sensitivity. What we found is that when we were going to hit some of these login pages, we would not get a response every single time we did it. And so we figured there'd be this one-off. There'd be one time it would fail, and then there'd be 100 times it would work, and one time it would fail. So what we did is we turned up the squelch on that and said, no, you have to have 2 failures in a row for there to really be an outage. And that eliminated a whole lot of the noise, raised the noise threshold to a point where we would actually tell when there would be an outage, and that was a big win. And then make it easy to edit the results. So what we try to do there is we want to be accurate. If there's a maintenance window that somehow they told the business and didn't tell us, we'd say, okay, that was not really an outage. It was a planned outage, which is not a degradation of service, and go in there and basically correct give them the A instead of the B on the report card, right? So we did that. And then the other part is a diplomatic approach to the self-policing. How do we get these applications, the application owners, to say, hey, I want to have this higher maturity. I want to know more about that. And I liken it to you want to have more policemen between your drive from home to work. Well, yeah, kind of. It depends. If there's some idiots that come speeding by you, and yeah, maybe. But the whole idea is that you want to have them want to have better monitoring. And so there's a whole soft layer of infrastructure there to get that to go. And then finally, to prove the value to the application owners. So how do you provide value? How do you say, okay, this is information that you can use? And so what's happened with this a couple times is we've had some of our applications, they would go and they would have a server that would run away, or the CPU just went through the roof. We've got an alert for that, and so we would alert them. And then they say, oh, geez, I didn't even know, because they're load balanced all over the place. And then so it's okay, so we did this. So it's an incremental thing. It's a gaining of trust, and you have to be there with all the trust. And so that's about it. So,
Great, thanks, Steve.